She had once danced for queens and presidents, but tonight Isabella moved between champagne flutes and caviar plates, her champion's grace hidden beneath a maid's uniform, until one cruel challenge would remind the world exactly who she used to be. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story will absolutely shatter your heart and rebuild it stronger. Tonight, a cruel billionaire, a hidden champion, and one waltz that exposes everything. Let's begin. She had once danced for queens and presidents, but tonight Isabella moved between champagne flutes and caviar plates, her champion's grace hidden beneath a maid's uniform, until one cruel challenge would remind the world exactly who she used to be. The Ashford Mansion's grand ballroom sparkled like a jewel box, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across marble floors that had once welcomed diplomats and royalty. Tonight, 300 of Manhattan's most powerful elite had gathered for the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, their combined net worth exceeding the GDP of small nations. Isabella Chen Williams navigated through the crowd with fluid precision, her movements unconsciously choreographed as she collected empty glasses and replaced wilted orchids. At 28, Isabella possessed the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be taught in finishing schools or bought with trust funds. Her dark skin seemed to absorb the golden light, and though her hair was pulled back in a simple bun required by her uniform, rebellious curls framed her face with defiant beauty. She had learned long ago to make herself invisible in rooms like this, not from shame, but from survival. Every step was measured, every gesture economical, her body remembering rhythms that once earned standing ovations at Lincoln Center. "More champagne over here," called a woman dripping in Cartier diamonds, barely glancing at Isabella as she approached. Isabella's smile remained professional, warm even, though something flickered in her dark eyes, a flash of recognition that she had once worn jewels far more exquisite than these, had once commanded attention rather than serving in its shadows. Across the ballroom, Alexander Ashford stood trapped in his own gilded cage. At 31, he had inherited his mother's gentle features and his father's imposing height, but none of the elder Ashford's ruthless ambition. His tailored Armani tuxedo fit perfectly, his smile practiced to corporate perfection, yet his gray eyes held the restless quality of a man yearning for something he couldn't name. He nodded politely as Mrs. Worthington droned about her latest acquisition, a Monet she'd bought at auction, but his attention kept drifting to the servers moving through the crowd. One server in particular. Alexander had noticed Isabella 3 months ago when his father had hired additional staff for these increasingly frequent social gatherings. There was something about the way she moved that set her apart from the others, a natural rhythm, an unconscious grace that seemed almost choreographed. He found himself positioning himself where he could watch her work, fascinated by how she could navigate through crowds without ever bumping anyone, how she seemed to anticipate needs before they were voiced. "Alexander, are you listening?" The sharp voice belonged to Vivian Blackwell, a senator's daughter his father had been pushing him toward for months. Beautiful in the way of expensive porcelain, perfectly assembled, but somehow fragile. "Of course," he replied smoothly, though he hadn't heard a word. His eyes followed Isabella as she moved toward the far end of the room, her hands steady despite carrying a tray of delicate crystal. What Alexander didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Isabella had once held audiences spellbound at the Kennedy Center, had been featured on the cover of Dance magazine, had been destined for greatness, until a torn ACL and her father's gambling debts had stolen everything in a single devastating year. The scholarship to Juilliard, the professional contracts, the apartment overlooking Central Park, all gone. The only thing left was muscle memory and a heart that still moved to music only she could hear. At the room's commanding center stood Harrison Ashford III, Alexander's father and tonight's host. At 62, Harrison was a man accustomed to owning everything he surveyed: companies, politicians, and people. His silver hair was slicked back with military precision, his cold blue eyes constantly calculating value and weakness. He had built his empire through a combination of brilliant strategy and ruthless execution, believing that sentiment was luxury he couldn't afford. Harrison commanded the room not through warmth but through the gravitational pull of absolute power. When he spoke, conversations paused. When he moved, paths cleared. He had made his fortune in real estate and private equity, but his true expertise lay in reading people, finding their pressure points, their vulnerabilities, their price. Tonight's gala would raise millions for the Children's Hospital, but for Harrison, charity was simply another form of social chess. Every donation, every handshake, every smile was an investment in future influence. He surveyed his domain with satisfaction, noting which politicians had attended, which business rivals had declined, which social climbers were trying too hard to gain his attention. "Dad," Alexander approached with the weariness of someone walking through a minefield. "The hospital administrator wanted to thank you personally for the wing donation." "Of course she did," Harrison replied without taking his eyes off the crowd. "Gratitude is cheap, results are what matter." His gaze swept across the servers and staff with the same calculating assessment he gave stock portfolios. "Though I do wish the hired help would move with more efficiency. This isn't a museum, it's a business function." Alexander followed his father's gaze and felt his stomach tighten as he realized Harrison was watching Isabella. She had paused near the orchestra, adjusting a flower arrangement with movements that seemed almost dance-like. For a moment, the music and her gestures synchronized perfectly, creating an inadvertent moment of poetry that several guests noticed and admired. Harrison noticed too, but with different eyes. What happens next will test every assumption in this glittering room about worth, about dignity, about the difference between true nobility and inherited arrogance. As Isabella moved toward the refreshment station, her path would soon intersect with Harrison's in a collision that would change 3 lives forever. What do you think makes someone truly worthy of respect? Their achievements, their character, or their circumstances? Share your thoughts below. The night was about to become much more than a charity gala. The collision happened in slow motion, like a scene from a tragic ballet. Isabella had been moving toward the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her tray balanced perfectly, despite the weight of crystal glasses and fine china. The orchestra had just begun Strauss's Blue Danube, a waltz that once made her heart soar but now felt like a ghost whispering her name. She was lost in the music for just a moment, her body naturally swaying to rhythms that had once been as essential to her as breathing. She didn't see Harrison Ashford stepping backward from his conversation with the mayor, didn't anticipate his sharp gesture, as he emphasized a point about municipal contracts. Their worlds collided with the crash of expensive crystal hitting marble floor. The entire ballroom fell silent. 300 conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the orchestra faltered, the violins trailing off into uncomfortable quiet. "You clumsy fool." Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His face flushed crimson as champagne dripped from his custom Italian suit, as shards of crystal spread across the floor like fallen stars. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs? What those glasses were worth?" Isabella stood frozen, her empty tray trembling in her hands. She had faced hostile audiences, demanding critics, and crushing disappointment, but something about Harrison's tone, the casual cruelty, the assumption of her worthlessness, hit her like a physical blow. "I'm so sorry, sir," she whispered, immediately dropping to her knees to collect the broken pieces. "I'll clean this up right away. I'll pay for the damages, I'll pay." Harrison's laugh was sharp and humorless. "With what? Your minimum wage salary?" He looked around the room, ensuring every important face was watching his performance. "This is exactly why I prefer to hire through proper agencies. Standards have clearly declined." Alexander stepped forward, his face pale. "Dad, it was an accident. I saw what happened." "Stay out of this, Alexander." Harrison's voice brooked no argument. This is about accountability. About knowing one's place. Isabella's hands stilled on the broken crystal. Something in Harrison's tone, the deliberate emphasis on place, made her look up. She saw the calculation in his cold blue eyes, the way he was feeding off the crowd's uncomfortable attention. This wasn't about accident or damages. This was about power, about putting someone he saw as lesser in what he considered their proper position. She rose slowly, dignity wrapping around her like armor. "Of course, Mr. Ashford. I understand completely." But Harrison wasn't finished. The room's energy, the absolute attention, the chance to demonstrate his authority, it was intoxicating. He could see Alexander's mortification, could feel the crowd's mixture of fascination and discomfort. In that moment, he made a decision that would haunt him forever. "You know what?" Harrison's voice carried across the silent ballroom. "I have a better idea, a more educational solution." The orchestra conductor, sensing drama, gestured for his musicians to remain ready. The crowd pressed closer, unable to look away from the unfolding spectacle. Harrison gestured toward the dance floor, his smile cruel and self-satisfied. "The orchestra is playing a waltz, a simple dance. Really, something any civilized person should be able to manage." He paused, savoring the moment. "If you can dance this waltz properly, mind you, with actual skill and grace, then perhaps we can overlook this costly mishap." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Alexander's face went white. "Dad, you can't be serious." "But if you can't," Harrison continued, his voice rising with theatrical flair, "if you stumble through it like the clumsy servant you've proven yourself to be, then perhaps you'll finally understand why positions exist for a reason." He leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "And if by some miracle, you actually manage to dance with the skill and elegance this room deserves." The pause stretched like a held breath. "Then you can marry my son." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed from every corner. Alexander looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Vivian Blackwell's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, adding another crash to the evening's destruction. Harrison basked in the shocked silence, in the absolute control he wielded over every person in the room. "After all," he continued with mock generosity, "shouldn't love conquer all? Isn't that what all the fairy tales teach us?" His laughter was like breaking glass. "Dance beautifully enough to deserve my son, and you can have him." Isabella stood motionless, her dark eyes fixed on Harrison's face. Around her, the elite of Manhattan society held their collective breath, waiting to see how the Black Maid would respond to the billionaire's impossible, humiliating challenge. Alexander found his voice, rough with horror. "This is insane. Isabella, you don't have..." "Isabella," Harrison repeated, tasting her name like wine gone sour. "How exotic. Tell me, Isabella, do they teach dancing where you come from? Or is rhythm something you people are just supposed to naturally possess?" The racist undertone hit the room like a slap. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one challenged him. The power dynamics were too clear, the social order too entrenched. Isabella's hands stopped trembling. Her spine straightened. In that moment, something shifted in her dark eyes. A fire that had been banked but never extinguished suddenly roared back to life. She looked at Harrison Ashford III, at his cruel smile, his confident assumption of her humiliation, his absolute certainty that he had won this game before it even began. She looked at Alexander, frozen between his father and his conscience, paralyzed by privilege and fear. Then she looked at the dance floor, at the marble expanse where she had once dreamed of dancing again. The orchestra waited, instruments poised. 300 of the most powerful people in Manhattan waited for her answer. Isabella set down her empty tray with deliberate precision. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the silent room. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her tone carefully controlled, "are you quite certain about the terms of this challenge?" Harrison's smile widened. He thought he heard defeat in her question, surrender wrapped in false dignity. Absolutely certain. Dance like you belong in this room, or accept that you don't. Isabella nodded once, a movement as graceful as a conductor's downbeat. Then I accept. The room erupted in whispers, but Isabella no longer heard them. She was listening to something else entirely, the opening notes of a waltz, and the sound of her own heart remembering what it meant to fly. Have you ever had a moment where you had to choose between backing down or showing the world who you really are? What would you do in Isabella's position? Share your thought in the comment. The dance was about to begin. The ballroom buzzed with electric tension as Isabella's acceptance hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. But instead of immediately taking the dance floor, she did something unexpected. She turned and walked toward the service corridor, her movements still graceful despite the tremor in her hands. Where is she going? Someone whispered. Is she running away? Harrison's triumphant smile faltered slightly. He had expected immediate capitulation or desperate, clumsy defiance. This controlled withdrawal felt somehow more dangerous. Alexander watched Isabella disappear through the staff entrance, his chest tight with a mixture of rage and helplessness. His father's challenge echoed in his mind, cruel, calculated, designed to humiliate. But there had been something in Isabella's eyes when she accepted, a flash of something that made Alexander's heart race with both fear and hope. Well, that was predictable, Harrison announced to the room, his voice carrying false joviality. Some people simply know when they're outmatched. He brushed imaginary dust from his champagne-stained jacket. Shall we return to the evening's actual purpose? But the crowd remained restless, unsatisfied. The promised spectacle had been snatched away, leaving them with uncomfortable questions and unfulfilled anticipation. In the mansion's service corridor, Isabella pressed her back against the cool wall, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts. The familiar scent of industrial cleaner and kitchen steam wrapped around her like a shroud, pulling her back to reality. What had she done? What had she been thinking? You can't do this, the voice in her head whispered urgently. It's been 5 years since you last performed. 5 years since the injury. 5 years since you were anyone other than a woman cleaning up other people's messes. Her right knee throbbed, a phantom pain that always returned when stress peaked. The torn ACL that had ended her career had healed, but the fear remained. What if she fell? What if her body betrayed her in front of all those people? The humiliation would be complete, total, devastating. Maria Santos, the head housekeeper, found her there, slumped against the wall like a broken doll. Misha, what happened out there? Everyone's talking about some challenge? Isabella's voice came out as a whisper. He wants me to dance. In front of everyone. Said if I can waltz properly, I can marry his son. Maria's weathered face hardened. She had worked for rich families for 30 years, had seen every variety of cruelty disguised as entertainment. And you said yes? Isabella, you don't have to prove anything to these people. Don't I? Isabella's laugh was bitter. Did you see how he looked at me, Maria? Like I was dirt on his shoe, like I was nothing. You're not nothing. Then why do I feel like I am? Isabella's composure finally cracked. I used to be somebody. I used to matter. Now I pick up their glasses and pretend I don't exist, and maybe that's all I deserve. Back in the ballroom, Alexander stood frozen as his father worked the crowd, spinning the evening's drama into entertainment. Guests approached Harrison with knowing smiles and congratulatory pats on the shoulder as if publicly humiliating a woman was cause for celebration. Brilliant theater, Harrison, chuckled Judge Morrison, his cheeks flushed with wine and vicarious cruelty. Put her right in her place, didn't you? Alexander's hands clenched into fists. The casual racism, the assumption that Isabella's humiliation was somehow justified, the way these people, his people, could watch a human being be destroyed and call it amusing. Alexander, darling? Vivian appeared at his elbow, her perfectly manicured hand touching his arm possessively. I have to admit, your father's handling of that situation was rather masterful, though I do think the marriage comment was perhaps a bit much." She laughed, a sound like breaking bells, as if that could ever actually happen. Why couldn't it? The words escaped before Alexander could stop them. Vivian's laugh died. "Excuse me," I said, "why couldn't it happen?" Alexander's voice was quiet, but something in his tone made nearby conversations pause. "Alexander," Vivian's voice carried warning, "you can't be serious. She's help. And she's what, Vivian?" The dangerous calm in Alexander's voice made Vivian step back. Around them a small circle of attention had formed, drawn by the tension crackling between them. "You know what she is?" Vivian said carefully, glancing around for support from the watching faces. "No," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength. "I know what you think she is. I know what my father thinks she is, but I don't think any of you actually know who she is." Harrison appeared beside them, his face a mask of parental concern that didn't quite hide his irritation. "Alexander, I think you're letting the evening's drama affect your judgment. Why don't we—" "My judgment?" Alexander turned to face his father fully, and for the first time in his adult life, Harrison saw something in his son's eyes that looked almost like strength. "You just publicly humiliated a woman for your own entertainment, and you're questioning my judgment? I taught a lesson about consequences and knowing one's place," Harrison replied coolly. "Something you seem to have forgotten." Father and son stared at each other across a gulf that seemed to widen with every passing second. The watching crowd sensed drama that might eclipse even the earlier spectacle. "And what is my place, exactly?" Alexander asked. "As my heir, as the future of this family, as someone who understands that certain boundaries exist for good reasons." "Boundaries," Alexander repeated slowly. "Is that what we're calling prejudice now?" Harrison's eyes flashed dangerously. "Careful, son. Or what? You'll challenge me to dance too?" The words hung in the air like an accusation. Around them, the cream of Manhattan society watched a billionaire family fracture in real time and found themselves unsure whether to be appalled or entertained. In that moment of electric tension, a sound drifted from the service corridor, music, soft but unmistakable. Someone was humming a waltz, the melody floating through the mansion like a ghost of forgotten dreams. Isabella was coming back. The resistance was crumbling, and the real battle was about to begin. The humming stopped. Isabella emerged from the service corridor transformed, not in appearance, but in bearing. She had removed her apron and let her hair down from its regulation bun, dark curls now framing her face with natural elegance. Her uniform remained the same, but somehow she wore it differently now, like armor rather than submission. The ballroom fell silent as she walked toward the dance floor, each step measured and purposeful. Alexander felt his breath catch. There was something different about her movement, a coiled power he'd never noticed before. "Well," Harrison announced loudly, "it seems our entertainment is returning, though I do hope we won't have another mishap." Isabella stopped at the edge of the dance floor and turned to face him directly. "Mr. Ashford, I need to clarify the terms of your challenge." "The terms are quite clear," Harrison replied, basking in the renewed attention. "Dance properly, or accept the consequences of your clumsiness." "And if I dance to your satisfaction?" Harrison's smile was predatory. "Then, as I said, you can marry my son, though I suspect that won't be necessary." Isabella nodded slowly. "Then I assume you'll be judging the quality of my performance?" "Along with everyone else present, naturally." Harrison gestured to the crowd. "I'm sure our guests can recognize skill when they see it." "Of course." Isabella's voice was steady, almost conversational. "But since this is your challenge, your house, your rules, perhaps you would do me the honor of being my partner." The suggestion hit the room like a bomb. Harrison's confident smile froze on his face. "Partner with the help? Dance with a black woman in front of Manhattan's elite? The very idea was so far beyond acceptable social boundaries that for a moment he couldn't even process it. That's hardly appropriate," he stammered. "Oh?" Isabella's voice carried just a hint of innocence. "But surely the fairest test of dancing skill requires a proper partner. How else can you accurately judge my ability?" Alexander watched his father's face cycle through confusion, anger, and something approaching panic. The challenge had been designed to humiliate Isabella while maintaining Harrison's position of superiority. Being forced to actually interact with her as an equal, even for the length of a dance, was never part of the plan. "I'm sure someone else could serve as," Harrison began. "I'll do it." Alexander's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. Every head turned toward him as he stepped forward, his gray eyes fixed on Isabella's face. "Alexander, no," Harrison hissed. "Why not?" Alexander's voice carried to every corner of the room. "She asked for a partner to make the test fair." "I'm volunteering." Harrison grabbed his son's arm. "This is ridiculous. You're making a spectacle." "I'm making it fair." Alexander gently but firmly removed his father's hand. "Isn't that what justice is supposed to be about?" Isabella studied Alexander's face, searching for mockery or pity, or the casual cruelty she'd learned to expect from his world. Instead, she saw something that made her chest tighten: genuine respect, and perhaps something deeper. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, meant only for him. "Neither do you," he replied. "But if you're brave enough to try, then I'm brave enough to partner you." The crowd rustled with excitement and discomfort in equal measure. This was not how these events usually unfolded. The clear social hierarchies, the predictable outcomes, everything was shifting in ways that made them both thrilled and deeply uneasy. Harrison found himself trapped by his own machinations. To refuse Alexander's participation would be to admit the challenge was never meant to be fair. To allow it would be to watch his son publicly align himself with someone Harrison had just finished humiliating. "Fine," Harrison said through gritted teeth. "But the same terms apply. If she fails to meet the standard expected in this room, then she accepts the consequences." "And if she succeeds?" Alexander asked. Harrison's laugh was sharp and humorless. "That seems highly unlikely." Isabella and Alexander faced each other on the dance floor, the space around them clearing as 300 guests formed a watching circle. The orchestra, sensing the dramatic tension, held their instruments ready. "I should probably mention," Alexander said quietly, "I'm not actually a very good dancer." "That's all right," Isabella replied, her voice just as soft. Something in her tone, quiet confidence, replacing earlier uncertainty, made Alexander look at her more carefully. There was a change in her posture, in the way she held her head, that suggested depths he'd never suspected. "There's something you should know about me," she continued, her dark eyes meeting his gray ones. "About who I used to be." "Isabella, no, you need to understand what you're signing up for." Her voice carried the weight of buried dreams and hidden pain. "Your father thinks he's watching a maid pretend to be something she's not. But what he's actually about to see is—" She paused, and for a moment Alexander saw through the careful mask she wore, glimpsed the woman she had been before life had forced her to become invisible. "What he's about to see is me remembering who I really am." The orchestra raised their instruments. Harrison stood at the edge of the dance floor like a judge at an execution, confident in the outcome he'd orchestrated. Around them, Manhattan's most powerful people waited to witness either a spectacular failure or something far more dangerous to their comfortable assumptions. Alexander offered Isabella his hand, and she took it. The moment their fingers touched, something electric passed between them, not just attraction but recognition. Two souls trapped in lives that didn't fit, finally seeing each other clearly. "Whatever happens," Alexander whispered, "I want you to know you don't have to prove anything to anyone." Isabella's smile was soft but fierce. "Maybe not, but I want to prove something to myself." The conductor raised his baton, In the watching crowd, phones appeared as guests prepared to capture what they assumed would be an entertaining disaster. Harrison's smile was triumphant and cruel. None of them were prepared for what came next. The music began. The opening notes of the waltz floated across the ballroom like a prayer made of sound. Isabella closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the music wash over her, and suddenly she wasn't a maid in a mansion anymore. She was 23 years old, standing in the wings of the Kennedy Center, her heart howling as announcer's voice echoed through the theater. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the youngest dancer ever to win the International Ballroom Championship, Isabella Chen Williams. Alexander felt the change in her immediately. Her hand in his became steady, confident. Her posture transformed, spine lengthening, shoulders settling into perfect alignment. When she opened her eyes, they held a fire he'd never seen before. "Follow my lead," she whispered, and began to move. What happened next defied every expectation in the room. Isabella didn't just dance, she floated, she flew, she became the music itself. Her body remembered everything. The countless hours of practice, the muscle memory burned into bone and sinew, the grace that had once made audiences weep with its beauty. Alexander, who had truthfully claimed to be a poor dancer, found himself moving with unexpected fluidity. Isabella's lead was so clear, so confident, that she made him better than he'd ever been. She guided him through turns and steps he'd never mastered in years of mandatory cotillion classes. The watching crowd fell into stunned silence. This wasn't the clumsy struggle they'd anticipated. This was artistry. Harrison's confident smile began to crack as Isabella swept across the floor with liquid grace, her movements so perfectly synchronized with the music that it seemed the orchestra was following her lead rather than the other way around. This wasn't possible. She was just a maid, just hired help, my God, breathed Mrs. Worthington, her Cartier diamonds forgotten, as she watched Isabella execute a flawless promenade that would have impressed even the Vienna Opera Ball. She's magnificent. 5 years earlier, Lincoln Center. Isabella stood at the pinnacle of her world, holding the crystal trophy that represented everything she'd worked for since childhood. At 23, she had conquered every ballroom in America, danced her way from the housing projects of Detroit to the most prestigious stages in the world. "How does it feel to be the youngest international champion in history?" the reporter asked, her camera crew capturing Isabella's radiant smile. "Like coming home," Isabella had answered, not knowing that home was about to be ripped away forever. The call came 3 days later. Her father, the man who had driven her to every practice, who had worked double shifts to pay for costumes and coaching, had lost everything in a poker game that went wrong. Not just his savings, but Isabella's prize money, her scholarship fund, even the money earmarked for her professional contracts. "The people he owes," her mother had whispered over the phone, her voice thick with tears. "They're dangerous. Isabella, we have to pay them." The choice was simple and devastating. Isabella liquidated everything, trophies sold to collectors, costumes to other dancers, her Manhattan apartment gone in a week. She took every penny she could raise and handed it to men in expensive suits who smiled like sharks. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The injury came during her final professional performance, a desperate attempt to earn the remaining money they needed. A torn ACL during a complex lift, her partner's grip failing at the crucial moment. As she lay on the Lincoln Center stage, watching her dreams bleed out across the marble floor, Isabella knew that Isabella Chen Williams, the champion, was dying. The woman who emerged from the hospital 6 months later was someone else entirely. Someone who cleaned houses and served drinks and pretended that the music no longer lived in her bones. Back in the Ashford Ballroom, Isabella spun through a series of natural turns that would have challenged professional dancers. Alexander followed her lead instinctively, his trust in her complete. Around them, the watching crowd began to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. "She's not just good, murmured Judge Morrison, his earlier congratulations to Harrison forgotten. "She's professionally trained, look at her technique." Harrison's face had gone pale. This wasn't humiliation, this was revelation. The woman he'd intended to destroy was demonstrating skills that surpassed most of the trained dancers he'd seen at society events. Alexander found himself lost in Isabella's grace, in the way she made him feel weightless and capable of impossible things. Their eyes met as she led him through a complex sequence, and he saw something that made his heart skip. She was enjoying herself. For the first time since he'd known her, Isabella looked truly alive. "You're incredible," he whispered as they moved through a series of chassés that looked effortless, but required extraordinary skill. Isabella's smile was radiant. "I used to be. You still are." The music swelled toward its crescendo, and Isabella made a decision that would shatter every remaining assumption in the room. She began to add elements that hadn't been in any basic waltz syncopated rhythms. Competitive-level variations, movements that required years of training to execute properly. She lifted onto her toes in a perfect arabesque turn that drew gasps from the crowd, then settled back into Alexander's arms with such fluid grace that it looked choreographed. She was no longer dancing a simple waltz. She was performing at championship level, her body remembering every competition, every standing ovation, every moment when she had been the best in the world. The crowd erupted in murmurs of amazement and recognition. Several guests pulled out phones, recording what they were beginning to realize was a once-in-a-lifetime performance. Harrison stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, his cruel challenge transforming into something he'd never intended, a showcase for talent he hadn't known existed, performed by a woman he'd underestimated in every possible way. As the final notes of the waltz approached, Isabella looked directly at Harrison while executing a flawless reverse turn that would have earned perfect scores in any competition. Her message was clear. "You thought you knew who I was. You thought you could break me. You were wrong. Have you ever had to hide your talents or dreams because of circumstances? What would it feel like to finally show the world what you're capable of?" The dance was reaching its climax, and with it, the moment of truth that would change everything. The final notes of the waltz hung in the air like stardust, as Isabella and Alexander came to a perfect stop, her body curved gracefully in his arms, their faces inches apart, both breathing hard from exertion and something far more profound than physical effort. For 3 heartbeats, the ballroom remained suspended in absolute silence. Then the applause began, not the polite, measured clapping typical of society events, but thunderous, genuine appreciation that rolled through the room like a wave. Guests surged forward, their earlier discomfort replaced by authentic amazement. "Extraordinary. Absolutely magnificent. I've never seen anything like it." Isabella straightened slowly, the champion's fire in her eyes beginning to dim as reality crashed back in. She had just performed at competition level in front of 300 people, had revealed herself completely. There was no hiding anymore, no pretending to be invisible. Everyone knew now that she was more than they had assumed. Alexander kept her hand in his as the crowd pressed closer, his grip steady and protective. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her eyes showed the vulnerability that followed any great performance, the exposure, the rawness of having poured everything into art. Harrison stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, his face a mask of controlled fury. His simple challenge had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humiliating Isabella, he had inadvertently given her a stage to shine brighter than anyone in the room. The cruel trap had become a triumph, and he was the only one who looked foolish. "Isabella." Mrs. Worthington approached first, her earlier dismissal forgotten. "My dear, where on earth did you learn to dance like that?" Before Isabella could answer, Judge Morrison joined them. "That wasn't amateur level. That was professional, competition level. I've seen dancers at Lincoln Center with less skill." The questions came faster now, the crowd's curiosity replacing their earlier assumptions. Isabella felt overwhelmed, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with social embarrassment and everything to do with having her carefully constructed invisibility shattered. Alexander sensed her discomfort and gently guided her away from the pressing crowd. "Excuse us," he said politely but firmly. "I think Isabella needs some air." He led her through the French doors onto the mansion's grand terrace, away from the buzzing crowd and into the cool September night. The city sparkled below them, distant and peaceful. Isabella walked to the marble railing and gripped it with both hands, her shoulders trembling slightly. The adrenaline of performance was fading, leaving her feeling raw and uncertain. "I shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "Why not?" Alexander joined her at the railing, careful to give her space. "It was beautiful. You were incredible. It was showing off. It was proving your father right about me not knowing my place." "My father was wrong about your place," Alexander said firmly, "and apparently wrong about everything else too." Isabella turned to look at him, studying his face in the soft light spilling from the ballroom windows. "You don't understand. I used to be somebody. I used to matter, and then I lost everything and I had to become this." She gestured toward her uniform. "Invisible, safe, small. What happened?" For a moment, Isabella considered deflecting, changing the subject, returning to the careful distance she maintained with everyone in this world. But something in Alexander's voice, genuine interest without pity, made her want to tell the truth. "I was the international ballroom champion," she said simply. 5 years ago, I was the youngest person ever to win. I had everything: sponsors, contracts, a future that looked golden." Alexander's eyes widened. "Isabella Chen Williams? You're Isabella Chen Williams?" She looked surprised that he recognized the name. "I saw you perform," he continued, his voice filled with wonder, "at Lincoln Center, about 6 years ago. You were, God, you were like nothing I'd ever seen. I remember thinking that watching you dance was like watching someone speak directly to God." Isabella's breath caught. "You were there, front row. My mother had season tickets, dragged me to everything. But you made me understand why people care about art." He paused, his voice softer. "What happened? Why are you here instead of—" "Life," Isabella said simply. "Family crisis, bad decisions, worse luck. My father gambled away my future, and I had to choose between my dreams and keeping my family alive." She managed a rueful smile. "I chose family. The injury was just the final nail in the coffin." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what she'd sacrificed. "I'm sorry," he said finally. I can't imagine losing everything like that." "Can't you?" Isabella turned to face him fully. "What about you? What dreams did you sacrifice for family expectations?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on Isabella's story that he hadn't considered the parallels in his own life. "That's different. I never had real talent like yours." "Didn't you? What did you want to be before you became heir to the Ashford Empire?" Alexander was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "A teacher. I wanted to teach history to kids who actually needed it, not prep school princes who already had everything handed to them." "Why didn't you?" "Because my father made it clear that wanting to help people instead of profit from them was a luxury the family couldn't afford." Alexander's laugh was bitter. "Turns out we both learned to hide who we really are." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had been forced to bury their authentic selves, recognizing each other across the divide of their shared loss. "Your father is going to be furious," Isabella said eventually. "My father has been furious my entire life. It's his natural state." Alexander turned to face her. "But you know what? For the first time, I don't care." "You should care. I'm just a maid, Alexander. After tonight, after all this drama, I'm still going to go back to cleaning up other people's messes." "Are you?" Alexander's voice held a challenge. Because the woman I just danced with, the woman who commanded that entire room, she doesn't seem like someone who should be invisible. Dreams don't pay rent, Isabella said practically, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe not. But maybe hiding from dreams doesn't either. Through the French doors, they could see Harrison working the crowd, no doubt trying to control the narrative of the evening's events. The guests were still buzzing with excitement, replaying the unexpected performance. "He's going to make me pay for this," Isabella said, watching Harrison's animated gestures. "Then let him try," Alexander said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "You've already shown everyone in that room exactly who you are. He can't take that back." Isabella looked at Alexander, really looked at him, and saw not the passive heir she'd assumed him to be, but a man finding his own courage in witnessing hers. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Alexander said, offering her his arm, "we go back inside and face whatever comes next. Together. Have you ever met someone who saw your true potential when you'd forgotten it yourself? How did that change your life?" As they walked back toward the ballroom, both Isabella and Alexander knew that the evening had changed them irreversibly. The question was whether they would have the courage to embrace that change, or whether the forces arrayed against them would prove too powerful to overcome. The moment Isabella and Alexander stepped back into the ballroom, they knew something had changed. The earlier atmosphere of amazed appreciation had curdled into something darker. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as they approached, and the looks they received ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Harrison stood at the center of a tight cluster of the evening's most influential guests, his voice carrying just loud enough for Isabella and Alexander to catch fragments: complete fabrication, obvious deception, inappropriate behavior. Mrs. Worthington, who had praised Isabella's performance just minutes earlier, now avoided eye contact entirely. Judge Morrison, who had compared her favorably to Lincoln Center dancers, suddenly found his champagne glass fascinating. "What's happening?" Alexander asked his approach, but his father's cold smile provided all the answer he needed. "Ah, there you are," Harrison announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "I was just sharing some interesting information with our guests." Isabella felt ice forming in her stomach. She recognized the tone, the predatory satisfaction in Harrison's voice. This was a man who had found his weapon and was preparing to use it. "You see," Harrison continued, his voice carrying the false warmth of a shark's smile, "after that rather elaborate performance, I became curious about our talented server's background. So I made a few calls to associates in the dance world." Alexander stepped closer to Isabella, instinctively protective. But Harrison wasn't finished. "Imagine my surprise when I discovered that yes, there was indeed an Isabella Chen Williams who won the International Ballroom Championship 5 years ago." Harrison paused for maximum effect. "The same Isabella Chen Williams who was investigated for competition fraud 6 months later." The words hit the ballroom like a bomb. Gasps echoed from every corner as Harrison's revelation sank in. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Alexander's voice was sharp with warning, but Harrison was in his element now. "According to my sources, there were serious questions about her family's gambling connections, about whether certain competitors had been encouraged to perform below their potential." Harrison's smile was triumphant and cruel. The investigation was dropped when she conveniently disappeared from the dance world entirely. "That's not true," Isabella whispered, but her voice was lost in the growing murmur of the crowd. "Isn't it?" Harrison pulled out his phone, showing what appeared to be a news article. The headline reads, "Champion Dancer Under Investigation for Competition Rigging." Quite damning, I'd say. Alexander grabbed the phone, his eyes scanning the screen. What he saw made his heart sink. It looked legitimate, official, devastating. The article detailed allegations that Isabella's father had been involved with gambling syndicates, that several of Isabella's major victories were under suspicion. "This is," Alexander began, but Harrison cut him off. This is exactly what it appears to be, Harrison announced to the room. We've all been treated to a performance by someone who may have built her entire career on fraud. Isabella stood frozen as 300 pairs of eyes turned toward her with a mixture of disgust, disappointment, and vindictive satisfaction. The same people who had applauded her performance now looked at her like she was something they needed to scrape off their shoes. Is it true? Alexander asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd's whispers. Isabella looked at him, at the doubt creeping into his gray eyes, at the way he held his father's phone like evidence at a trial, and something inside her shattered. You believe him, she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. After everything, after what we just shared, you actually believe him? I'm asking for the truth, Alexander said, but his tone carried an edge of uncertainty that cut Isabella deeper than any outright accusation. The truth, Isabella's voice rose, carrying across the ballroom. The truth is that my father made mistakes that destroyed our family. The truth is that investigators looked into every victory I ever earned because people like you, she gestured toward Harrison, couldn't believe that a black girl from Detroit could be legitimately better than everyone else. The investigation, Harrison began, was dropped because there was no evidence of wrongdoing. Isabella's voice cracked with fury and pain. Because I earned every single title, every medal, every moment of recognition through years of work, while people like you assumed I must have cheated to succeed. She turned back to Alexander, her dark eyes blazing with betrayal. But you don't want to hear that, do you? It's easier to believe I'm exactly what your father says I am, just another fraud who doesn't belong in your world. Isabella, that's not, isn't it? She stepped back from him, and the distance felt like a chasm opening between them. 5 minutes ago, you were ready to defend me against anything. Now one article that confirms your father's prejudices, and you're asking if I'm a cheater. Alexander felt the truth of her words like a slap. He had let doubt creep in, had allowed his father's manipulation to undermine what he'd witnessed with his own eyes. I just needed to understand. You needed to understand nothing, Isabella said, her voice breaking. You watched me dance. You felt what we created together. But the moment someone gave you permission to doubt me, you took it. The crowd watched the confrontation with rapt attention, their discomfort forgotten in the face of such raw drama. Harrison's smile was one of complete satisfaction. He had successfully destroyed whatever connection had formed between his son and the woman who had dared to challenge his authority. Isabella. Alexander reached toward her, but she stepped away. No. Her voice was quiet now, but it carried more finality than any shout. I spent 5 years making myself invisible because I thought it was safer than being seen. Tonight, I let myself believe that someone could see the real me and value what they found. She looked around the room at all the faces watching her pain like entertainment. I was wrong. She began walking toward the service corridor, her shoulders straight, despite the devastation radiating from every line of her body. Where are you going? Alexander called after her. Isabella paused at the doorway and turned back one final time. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every dream she'd buried, every compromise she'd made, every moment she'd chosen survival over hope. Back to being invisible, she said. It's what everyone wants anyway. She disappeared through the service door, leaving behind a ballroom full of people who had witnessed not just a performance, but a destruction. Alexander stood alone in the center of the dance floor, his father's phone still in his hand, surrounded by the wreckage of the most real connection he'd ever felt. Harrison clapped slowly, mockingly. Well, he announced to the room, I think that settles the evening's entertainment, doesn't it? But even in his moment of triumph, Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that his victory had cost him something he hadn't intended to lose, and that the woman who had just walked away might have taken his son's heart with her. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between believing someone you care about and believing what others tell you about them? How do you decide who to trust? The shatter point had been reached, and nothing would ever be the same. 3 hours had passed since Isabella disappeared into the night, and Alexander stood alone in his father's study, staring at the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows. The guests had finally left, their appetites for drama satisfied, leaving behind empty champagne glasses and the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with something that felt like shame. The investigation article lay on Harrison's mahogany desk, the smoking gun that had destroyed everything in a matter of minutes. Alexander had read it thoroughly now, had made calls to contacts in the dance world, had done what he should have done before doubt poisoned his heart. The article was real, the investigation had happened, but buried in the final paragraphs, in language deliberately obscured by legal terminology, was the truth. Isabella had tried to tell him all charges had been dropped due to complete lack of evidence. The investigation had been sparked not by actual wrongdoing, but by an anonymous tip that investigators later determined came from a rival dancer's jealous parent. Isabella Chen Williams had been completely exonerated. Her victories had been legitimate, her talent genuine, her integrity intact. Alexander had failed her in the moment she needed him most. Still brooding, Harrison entered the study with 2 glasses of brandy, offering one to his son with the satisfied air of a general who had won a decisive battle. "You knew," Alexander said without turning from the window. "You knew she was innocent." Harrison's pause was answer enough. "I knew she was a threat to the natural order of things. I knew she was making you forget who you are." "Who am I, Dad?" Alexander finally turned to face his father. "Because I'm not sure anymore. You're an Ashford. You're my heir. You're someone who understands that sentiment is a luxury we can't afford." Harrison settled into his leather chair with practiced authority. What happened tonight was necessary. That woman was becoming a distraction. "That woman," Alexander said quietly, "is the most extraordinary person I've ever met. Extraordinary at deception, perhaps. Did you see how easily she played the victim? How quickly she turned the room against me?" Alexander stared at his father with growing clarity. "She didn't turn anyone against you, Dad. You did that yourself when you tried to humiliate a woman for your own entertainment." Harrison's eyes flashed dangerously. "Careful, Alexander. Or what? You'll destroy me too?" Alexander's voice gained strength with each word. "You'll manufacture some evidence of my unworthiness. Find some way to make me doubt myself the way you made me doubt her? I made you see reality. You made me choose between my integrity and your approval." Alexander set down the untouched brandy, and for a moment there, "I chose wrong." Across the city, Isabella sat on the narrow bed in her studio apartment, still wearing her maid's uniform, staring at a cardboard box she hadn't opened in 5 years. Inside were the remnants of her former life, photographs from competitions, newspaper clippings, the crystal trophy from the international championship that she'd never been able to bring herself to sell. Her phone had been ringing for hours. Maria, worried about her sudden disappearance. Other staff members who'd heard about the evening's drama. Unknown numbers that were probably reporters, drawn by whatever version of tonight's story was already spreading through social media. She'd ignored them all. The only call that mattered, the only voice she both hoped for and dreaded, had been silent. Isabella opened the box with trembling fingers and pulled out a photograph. It showed her at 23, radiant with victory, holding her championship trophy high as confetti rained around her. The woman in that picture had believed the world was full of possibility, that talent and hard work could overcome any obstacle. That woman had been young and naive and heartbreakingly hopeful. "What would you do?" Isabella asked the photograph. "If you knew that showing the world who you really are would only give them better ammunition to destroy you?" Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment her heart leaped, thinking it might be Alexander. Instead it was from Maria. "Misha, whatever happened tonight, don't let them make you small again. You were magnificent." Isabella smiled through her tears. Maria had watched her transform from a broken ex-champion into someone who could survive in the shadows, but tonight, for a few perfect moments, Isabella had remembered what it felt like to fly. Another text appeared, this one from an unknown number. Saw video of your dance online. Still training dancers in Detroit if you're interested. Coach Martinez. Isabella's breath caught. Coach Martinez had been her first real instructor, the one who'd seen potential in a skinny kid from the projects and helped her believe she could be great. If he was reaching out, it meant tonight's performance had traveled far beyond the Ashford mansion. A third message appeared. Is this Isabella Chen Williams? This is Rebecca Foster from Dance World magazine. Would you be available for an interview? Then another. Incredible performance. Are you available for private lessons? Mrs. Park. Isabella's phone kept buzzing with messages, each one representing a possibility she'd thought was lost forever. The dance world, it seemed, had not forgotten Isabella Chen Williams after all. But none of the messages were from Alexander. Back in the mansion, Alexander stood in the doorway of his childhood bedroom, looking at a life that suddenly felt like an elaborate prison. Framed diplomas from Harvard and Wharton hung on walls that had never felt like home. Awards for business achievements that had never brought him joy gathered dust on shelves. On his nightstand sat a single photograph, Alexander at 8 years old, arm around his mother, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. His mother, who had died when he was 12, had been the last person to encourage his dreams of teaching, of making a difference in the world instead of just making money. What would you tell me to do, Mom? He whispered to the photograph. As if in answer, he remembered her voice from years past. True character, Alexander, is what you do when doing the right thing costs you everything. Alexander picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Isabella's number. He'd never called it before. Their interactions had always been brief, professional, carefully maintained within appropriate boundaries. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. Then he put the phone down and walked to his closet. If he was going to fight for the woman he loved, if he was going to choose authentic connection over inherited privilege, he couldn't do it from behind the safety of a phone call. Some conversations required showing up in person. Some choices required courage that could only be demonstrated through action. Alexander grabbed his keys and headed for the door, his father's voice calling after him. Where are you going? To make a choice that should have been made hours ago, Alexander replied without looking back. When facing a choice between what's safe and what's right, what helps you find the courage to choose correctly? Have you ever had to risk everything for someone you believed in? The night was far from over, and the most important dance was yet to come. Alexander found Isabella's apartment building at 2:47 a.m., his heart pounding as he climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs. The building was modest, clean but worn, a universe away from the marble and crystal of his father's mansion. When he reached her door, he could see light seeping from beneath it, could hear the faint sound of music playing inside. He knocked softly, then waited, his breath visible in the cool hallway air. The music stopped. Footsteps approached the door, paused. Isabella, he said quietly. It's Alexander. Please. I need to talk to you. Silence stretched between them, separated only by a thin wooden door that might as well have been an ocean. Alexander pressed his palm against the cool surface, imagining her standing just inches away, deciding whether he deserved even the chance to explain. The door opened slowly, revealing Isabella in simple jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, vulnerable, but also somehow more herself than he'd ever seen her in the mansion's formal uniform. It's almost 3 in the morning, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I know, I'm sorry. I couldn't wait until morning to tell you that I was wrong. Alexander's words tumbled out in a rush, completely devastatingly wrong. Isabella leaned against the doorframe, studying his face. About what, exactly? About doubting you. About letting my father's manipulation get between us and what I knew to be true. Alexander pulled out his phone, showing her the screen. I read the entire investigation report, Isabella. All of it. I called 3 different sources in the dance world. Isabella's expression didn't change, but he saw her shoulders relax slightly. You were cleared of all charges. Alexander continued, completely exonerated. The investigation was based on a false tip from someone jealous of your success. There was never any evidence of wrongdoing because there was no wrongdoing. I tried to tell you that. I know, and I should have believed you immediately. Alexander's voice cracked with emotion. I should have trusted what I saw in your eyes, what I felt when we danced together. Instead, I let my father's poison make me doubt the most honest person I've ever met. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Why are you here, Alexander? Because I love you, he said simply. Because watching you dance tonight was like watching someone set the world on fire with pure beauty. Because talking to you on that terrace was the first real conversation I've had in years. Because you make me want to be the man I was supposed to be instead of the one I've been trained to be. Isabella's breath caught, but she didn't speak. And because, Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength, I want to help you reclaim what was stolen from you. What do you mean? Alexander smiled, and for the first time that night, it reached his eyes. Come with me. There's something you need to see. 30 minutes later they stood outside the Ashford mansion as the sun began to touch the horizon. Isabella looked confused, uncertain, but she had trusted Alexander enough to come with him. Alexander, if your father sees me. He won't, Alexander said, leading her not to the main entrance but around to the mansion's conservatory, a glass-walled room that housed Harrison's collection of rare orchids. He's asleep, and besides, this isn't about him anymore. Inside the conservatory, Alexander had set up something that made Isabella gasp: professional lighting equipment, a camera crew, and in the center of the space, a perfect parquet dance floor. What is this? Isabella whispered. This, said a familiar voice, is your comeback. Isabella spun around to see Coach Martinez emerging from behind the camera equipment, his weathered face creased in a proud smile. The man who had first taught her to dance, who had believed in a skinny kid from Detroit when no one else would. Coach? Isabella's voice was barely audible. How are you? What are you? Alexander called me 3 hours ago. Coach Martinez said, approaching with open arms. Told me about tonight's performance, about what happened. Sent me the video that's already got 500,000 views on social media. 500,000? Isabella looked stunned. Misha. Coach Martinez took her hands in his gnarled ones. The dance world never forgot Isabella Chen Williams. We've been waiting 5 years for you to remember who you are. Alexander stepped forward, his voice gentle. The video of our dance has been shared by every major dance publication online. Rebecca Foster from Dance World magazine has been calling my phone for 2 hours. 3 different dance companies have reached out about potential contracts. Isabella sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed. I don't understand. You lit a fire tonight. Coach Martinez said. Not just in that ballroom, but across the entire dance community. People are remembering why you were special, why you mattered. They want Isabella Chen Williams back. Alexander knelt beside her chair. And this, he gestured to the equipment, is your chance to show them you never really left. A comeback performance, Coach Martinez explained. Professional quality. Broadcast live across all social media platforms. Your choice of music, your choice of partner. He smiled. Your choice of future. Isabella looked between the 2 men, one who had shaped her past, one who might be her future, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years, hope. But the investigation, the scandal, is being addressed, Alexander said firmly. I've already contacted every major publication that covered the original story. They'll be running corrections and clarifications within the week. The truth will be told, Isabella, your reputation will be restored. Isabella stood slowly, walking to the center of the makeshift dance floor. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls, casting rainbow patterns across the polished wood. She closed her eyes and let herself feel the music that never really stopped playing in her heart. What would I dance to? She asked quietly. Coach Martinez smiled. What would Isabella Chen Williams, international champion, dance to? Isabella opened her eyes, and Alexander saw the fire return, not just flickering, but blazing. Pachelbel's Canon, she said, without hesitation. The piece I was supposed to perform at the Olympics before life got in the way, Alexander finished. But life is giving you a second chance now. Isabella looked at Alexander. This man who had driven across the city at 3 a.m., who had assembled a professional crew and contacted her former coach, who had fought to restore her reputation and her future. Why? She asked. Why would you do all this for me? Alexander took her hand, and just like on the dance floor hours earlier, electricity passed between them. Because someone once told me that true character is what you do when doing the right thing costs you everything. And because I'd rather lose my father's fortune than lose the chance to spend my life with the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. Isabella smiled, the first genuine smile Alexander had seen from her since their dance. Your father is going to disown you. Good, Alexander said. I'm tired of being his son. I'd rather be your partner. In dance? In everything. Isabella squeezed his hand, then turned to face the cameras. Coach, cue the music. Alexander, if you're going to be my partner, you'd better be ready to keep up. As the opening notes of Pachelbel's Canon filled the conservatory, Isabella began to move with the fluid grace that had once conquered the world. But this time, she wasn't dancing just for judges or audiences or even for redemption. She was dancing for the love of movement, for the love of second chances, for the love of a man who had seen her true self and chosen to fight for it. Alexander followed her lead, just as he had in the ballroom, but now without hesitation, without doubt. Together, they created something beautiful and true and lasting, a dance that would be shared millions of times, that would restore Isabella's reputation and launch her second career, that would prove that sometimes the most unlikely love stories are the ones that change everything. As the music swelled and Isabella lifted into a perfect arabesque, the morning sun caught her face, and Alexander knew he was watching not just a comeback, but a transformation. Isabella Chen Williams was reclaiming her throne, and she was taking him with her into a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The dance ended with Isabella in Alexander's arms, both of them breathing hard, both of them laughing with the pure joy of dreams reborn. So, Alexander whispered against her ear, "What happens now?" Isabella smiled, the champion's fire blazing in her dark eyes. "Now we dance. For the rest of our lives, we dance. What dreams have you buried that might still be waiting for their second chance? Sometimes the most beautiful comebacks happen when we least expect them. Share your story of hope reborn. Your words might inspire someone else to reclaim their dreams too." The waltz had ended, but their real dance was just beginning.
The end. The tale transforms from cruel challenge to triumphant love, showing how genuine connection and courage can overcome prejudice and restore dreams. Isabella and Alexander both found their authentic selves through their connection, and love truly conquered all. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's more emotional, more shocking, and more beautiful than anything you can imagine. Don't let it slip away. Click that next story appearing on your screen right now. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Beautiful soul.